For a lot of us gardeners, we're used to growing gardens that give us something either to eat or to pop in a vase, but one type of garden we've lost touch with is the dye garden. This was an essential collection of plants in traditional gardens going back centuries that has largely been forgotten, and that we're just starting to get into. I want to show you what's possible for you to grow to create your own incredible natural dyes. Hey, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, we cover a range of gardening topics from growing tutorials to soil regeneration. I got the chance to visit my sister Brittany, who lives in Western Washington, and who also happens to be an expert in natural dyeing. She has her own collection of natural dyed yarns and has been practicing natural dyeing for nearly a decade. So if that interests you, you will definitely want to check out her channel, Textile Indie. She's got lots of amazing tutorials over there. And with that, let's talk about dye gardens.
What is a dye garden? A dye garden is a collection of plants that create pigments or colorants that you can use on fabrics and other materials, usually a protein or a plant fiber like wool, silk, cotton, hemp, and you can take the plants, process them in different ways, and create wonderful colors that come from the natural world.
Reasons why you'd want to have a dye garden in your overall garden is the first is that it's an eco-friendly approach, so you're not using toxic chemicals or adding toxins to our water supply by creating these dyes. They're all natural and they all go back into the system and it's fine.
And when you make a dye bath, you end up with a lot of wastewater, especially when you're immersion dyeing, which means you have a full pot of the dye material and you're using up a lot of water. And natural dyes, you can dump that water back into your garden to water your plants, so you're able to recycle that material. The contrast would be if you are chemical dyeing, you don't want to dump that into your gardens, especially your vegetable gardens, because it is full of chemicals and it can end up killing your plants. The next reason to grow a dyer's garden is that natural dyes are typically non-toxic in the way that chemical dyes would impact your soil or impact the water table. Natural dyes, like dumping the dye bath into your garden, you can reuse that water and use it to water your plants. The dyes typically are also a little bit healthier. There's not an exhaust when you're heating the dye bath. I will say that you still want to have dye specific tools that you use so you're not cross-contaminating your dye pots and your cooking pots. I like to make sure that, you know, my spaghetti pot is one pot and I have my dye pot labeled dye pot, so that the mordants and other things that you're using, they're not as toxic as chemical dyes, but there's still some toxicity to consider, and we are using plants that aren't necessarily food, so just being aware of that. But overall, it's a lot less toxic than chemical dyes.
Our third reason why you want to do a dye garden is it's a much more sustainable approach than shipping in dyes from other places where they're maybe petroleum based, they're based on resources that maybe are not going to have a super long lifespan, whereas, you know, you can grow a plant in your garden every year. This depends on how much space you have, how much you can grow, but you can grow every year. You always have access to it as long as you're saving your seeds, especially. So if you're saving your seeds and you're growing in your own garden, it's just unlimited how much you can continue that process in the future. It's much more sustainable than using the earth's resources that are limited, or the shipping, the labor, that are people being paid a sustainable amount to create those dyes, or is it sketchy how much they're being paid or how the work conditions are for them, where is it coming from,
how the land's being treated.
Yeah. So you have control over, you know, it's like a regenerative approach, or, you know, it's a sustainable approach. You're treating your soil well, treating your land well, and you're the one doing the labor, so you can treat yourself well. So yeah. I think that's like one of the reasons why.
Cassie also mentioned saving your seeds and being able to plant them year after year, which dye plants, because you need so much, if you're purchasing dyes or even chemical dyes in order to do your dyeing, you are putting out a lot of money, because that's something that you have to, it runs out. You have to repurchase new materials, and natural dyes, you need a lot to be able to dye with. So being able to replant your garden every year, harvest the seeds at the end of the season, and then have that resource, it can eventually work itself into being a practically free, as far as seeds go, process to recreating color every year, which is a really exciting thought. Another benefit of a natural dye garden is that it connects us to tradition and cultural heritage. Every culture has a natural dye tradition. Natural dyes were the source of color until somewhere in the 1800s, where a scientist came up with the color mauve. And ever since, we've developed colors and now have chemical dyes that we use in our clothing and different processes. But before that, all of the colorations that we had in our clothing, in any sort of woven or fiber material, came from natural dyes. And each culture had a palette of colors that were available to them. So dependent on the soil that they had, the plants that they could grow, the insects or minerals that they had available to them, their palette was formed by those variables. It's just really cool to kind of connect with that, and depending on where you live, try to grow out a palette that's related to that place. And later we'll be talking about the different plants that you can grow in your garden to create color. And a lot of these have been around for a really long time. They used to use these colors to dye anything that was fibrous.
So the next reason why you'd want to have your own dye garden is you can create unique colors that no one else probably in the world has that exact same shade, just because of the amount of plant you used, how it grew,
the water,
how it,
the soil,
stuck to the fabric, you know, all those things. And who doesn't like being unique? So
that's a good point.
Just join the uniqueness of, you know, natural dyes and express yourself through your own unique colors. That's another reason why you want to have a dye garden.
Yeah, there's a lot of variables that dictate the colors that you can achieve. And I recently was dyeing with cochineal, which is the exoskeleton of a beetle. Different than dye plants, but I achieved two very different colors. I did the same thing, but because one harvest was in Peru and one harvest was in Mexico, the coloration was so different. And it's just because of the location and the water that they were drinking or the foods that they were eating off of. The variables are so wide and different. The water impact of what minerals are in the water, the soil impact of what minerals are in the soil, the weather in the year that you're growing it. A dye garden has much diversity, and year to year it can be very different. Growing a natural dye garden opens up a lot of creativity options because you can explore the different colors, you can play around with dyeing different materials, dyeing fabric, yarn. You can do immersion dyeing or eco-printing, terms that maybe you're not familiar with, but Casting Taylor will be talking more about that as they grow their garden. And you can kind of explore just different ways of using that color and getting different results.
Just because this garden is useful doesn't mean that it's not also beautiful. And I think that a lot of the plants that we've chosen to grow this next year for our dye garden are going to just add to the overall beauty of the garden. So, I mean, cottage gardens are sort of hip right now because of the way they look, but cottage gardens typically are very useful. Like, every part of the garden is for something. The traditional garden is beautiful and also useful. I'm excited to see how it's going to add to our garden this year.
Yeah, there's a lot of great flowers in a dye garden, and I mean, things like red amaranth, which is a stunning plant, so yeah, it'll be fun to see the results.
And the sulfur cosmos.
Yeah.
Very beautiful.
So happy.
Okay, so last reason that you would want to grow a dye garden is you're just getting back out into nature. The more you're outside, the more a lot of things happen. Like, mental health is better, your overall physical health is better, just exercise outside, getting sunlight, close to nature, getting reconnected to natural rhythms. Anytime you garden, especially in a natural way, you're just gonna increase the quality of your life. We always recommend getting out in the garden, and if you want to try a little hobby of dyeing, why not grow the plants, you know, and then dye.
It's a deeper connection with your property or the land that you are living on. And the fulfillment that you get from gardening, if you're here, I'm assuming you love gardening. I feel very satisfied and fulfilled by it. As a fiber artist and natural dyer, I get that same fulfillment, or probably very similar, fulfillment and satisfaction from using dye plants or natural dyes to dye something that then I use. And it really moves you out of materialism because you really have to connect with the time and attention, and it is a full season process to go from planting the seeds to growing the plants to processing that and then preparing the fibers and actually dyeing something. And the amount of effort and kind of emotional input that goes into all of that really adds a lot of value. In natural dyeing, I like to consider that there are 3 levels of dyes. There are fugitive dyes, semi-permanent dyes, and classic dyes. Fugitive dye is a dye that is going to fade in light or with many washings. It's one that isn't very stable, and so it doesn't interact with the fiber and bond to the fiber the way you would need it to use for garments. But it is really fun to see the results. So if you're someone that just likes to experiment and explore colors and how colors apply to fabric, and you're using a piece and it's not going to be in full light or you're not going to wash it, then it's totally worth playing around with. An example of a fugitive dye would be Hopi Red Amaranth. That's one that doesn't bond with the fiber long term. Another one would be pokeberry, which we're not going to be talking about, but I just like to mention it. It's a berry and happens to be toxic when you eat it, so don't eat it. But it does pop up sometimes as a wild plant, and it is one that dyes a really brilliant pink, but it washes right out, so it doesn't have any longevity.
So a fugitive dye would be maybe great for like Easter egg dyeing.
Yes.
There are some things we dye that we don't actually want to last forever, so
or don't need to.
Or don't need it to, so that could be a great
Yeah.
use for that.
Yeah. Any kitchen scrap dyes like onion skins, purple cabbage, anything that you would like scraps you would gather from the kitchen, or a food, or berries. Berries is a big one that on your fingers they'll leave a dye. Those things fade really quickly. So if you're doing something you want to last long term, kind of move away from those as your dye source. But yeah, Easter eggs are great with any of those things. A semi-permanent dye would be one like a flower dye, where they bond pretty well, but over time in extended light exposure or with many washings, they are going to fade, which is actually kind of a cool thing because they sort of mimic a garden and how gardens, they grow throughout the spring and summer, and then they fade in the fall and die throughout the winter, and then they rebirth in the spring again. Semi-permanent dyes are that way, where you can dye them and then over time they slowly fade and kind of change color, not to a different color, but go from like a brilliant yellow to more of a buttery faded yellow. But you can re-dye something. So if you wanted to kind of mimic the garden cycle with your dyeing, you could re-dye in the new season or with a new harvest of dye plants. An example of that would be Dyer's Chamomile. I think safflower fits in this category pretty well. Cosmos probably is going to fade a little bit more than other plants.
The sulfur cosmos.
Yeah, sulfur cosmos. Yeah. Yep. And then the last category is classic dyes. And I label these classic dyes because they're dyes that have been around for a long time. And to get a little nerdy, the Latin term usually has tinctoria or tinctorum in the name, and these have been bred to use as a colorant or a dye.
It's like an easy way to look and be like, will this dye last for a long time? Does it say it's a dye in the Latin? And then you're like, yeah, it's a trick.
Yeah. So things like weld is a classic dye, and you can use it to dye things yellow, but you can also use it in combination with indigo to create green. So the blue of the indigo and the yellow of the weld, if you over dye the two, you get some awesome greens.
Is that like true and Japanese indigo?
Yeah.
Okay.
You'll just get a slightly different green color. And then madder, which is another one. We won't be planting that this time because it takes multiple years to do a harvest, but that's another classic dye where you use the roots to create some reds. Another one on the list is woad. It's actually the European version of indigo. There's the indigo plant, and then in Europe, or throughout Europe, in ancient times they used woad as the blue color. There are some plants that grow in the garden that have the ability to adhere or bond to fiber without needing a mordant, which is a metal salt that you apply to fibers to get the color bond to happen. Things like rhubarb have that natural color bonding chemical in them, or in the material itself, and usually it's called a tannin. So anything that's more tannic, like tea or coffee, any sort of wood bark or things like acorns, walnuts, they have tannins or natural tannins in them, and so you don't usually have to use a mordant to get the bond to happen because they already have that in the material. So rhubarb is a good one. Another one is pomegranate. A good one that you can grow in the garden is rhubarb, and you can actually use that as, or in combination with other garden plants to create richer colors.
Is rhubarb a green?
Rhubarb is pale yellow.
Pale.
Yeah, but you can use it in combination to strengthen some other garden plants or flowers.
This year in our garden, we are going to be doing several different types of gardens that you're going to see on our channel. We're going to be doing an herb tea garden, this dye garden, our flower garden, dried flower garden. We're going to do our veggie garden and perennial garden. We're doing all these different gardens, and we're all starting them from seed. So basically trying to like lower the entry point. If you go to a nursery and you want to buy plants and you've got $15, that's 3 plants, and that is going to fill nothing. Even if you just have like a raised bed, that's not even fill a raised bed. If you go to the nursery and buy 3 seed packets with $15, you have suddenly hundreds of plants. So this idea of like starting your garden from seed, it just enables pretty much anyone, no matter how much money you have, to have beautiful gardens. And so it creates a lower entry point for most people. So that's why we're focusing on starting gardens from seed, is because we want everyone to have access to having a beautiful garden. No matter how much money you make or how much money you have, you can have a beautiful garden. I'm gonna get seeds for a dye garden, and I'm gonna talk you through which ones we're gonna do this year. So this year we're focusing on annuals. So these are plants that we can grow in one year and harvest in that same year. So we're gonna skip all the like long-term things, like maybe madder, some more long-term thing.
Or black-eyed Susans.
Or black-eyed Susans that might take more than 1 year. And we're gonna grow annuals. So the first one we're gonna grow is Coreopsis, and this is a flower. It's a pretty little yellow flower, depending on which variety you get. Some are just yellow, some have a brown or black in them in the yellow. So that's a beautiful flower to have in your garden. The second one is marigold, and with marigolds you can do, there's different varieties or different types of marigolds. Some seed packets say on them what type of marigold they are, and some don't. So it actually doesn't matter which ones they are, but if you want to pick a type, you could do a French marigold. Also bright orange and yellow colors, very fun in the garden, bring a lot of interest. The third thing we're gonna grow this year is Japanese indigo, and Japanese indigo we may or may not be able to actually dye with this year, because you do have to accumulate a lot of it in order to dye something blue. We're gonna start, we're gonna see how it does in our zone 6B in Eastern Washington. We'll see how well it does and just do a little test on that.
And I had forgotten to mention this earlier, but we could do a fresh indigo dye, which
we could also try a fresh indigo.
Could be a cool experiment here.
Yeah. The next one is safflower, which is also a pretty yellow flower. Chamomile, this is a specific dyer's chamomile, so don't go into the grocery store and buy a pack of chamomile seeds.
Like German chamomile?
Yeah, it'll probably be a German chamomile or Roman chamomile, most likely German. German is the one that you want for tea. In our tea garden video, you can learn all about German chamomile, but for this garden, dye garden, you want a dye chamomile, a dyer's chamomile. You can tell in the Latin the difference, so you just want to look at the Latin and make sure that you're getting the right chamomile.
Yeah, and they have yellow petals and a yellow center, so that's another way to identify it.
Yeah, and those are all in the same family as feverfew too, so they all kind of have a similar look to feverfew. So if you love feverfew like I do, you love having chamomile in your garden. True indigo is more of an experiment for this year because it is a subtropical plant, so we do not live in a tropical climate. We live in a very dry climate. We'll see how it goes, but it's kind of an experiment. We basically will have 3 different blues to try through the 3 different plants we're using.
Third being woad.
The third being woad, which we'll get to. We're also gonna grow the Hopi red amaranth, and we'll maybe save that one to do eggs for Easter with our kiddos. And then we're gonna do a sulfur cosmos. So if you're a flower gardener, you know all about cosmos. You probably haven't grown sulfur cosmos because it's not as popular in cut flower arrangements. You probably have grown more of the pinks or the whites, the Rubenza, those types of colors.
Which you can also dye with.
Yeah, which you can also dye with, especially probably Rubenza, I'm imagining, because it's that deeper red. But sulfur cosmos is a very bright orange. Think about where you're going to plant these plants in your garden, because they will be eye poppers and you will see them. Stinging nettle is, it does sting. So be aware, even from a seedling stage, if you brush it with your hand, it will hurt. So I'm gonna opt for growing my stinging nettle in a pot, because they also are spreader plants, so they will take over the garden, and then you have to be weeding stinging nettle, and that is not sound fun. So I'm gonna grow my stinging nettle in a pot because I'm gonna use it for tea and for dye. So I'm gonna grow it with my mint and other things like that to keep it from spreading in the garden, and also to maintain it in a place where the kids can't touch it, because that would not be fun for anyone. So woad is our third blue plant that we're gonna try. It's the European version of indigo. So we'll try that out and see how it goes. More of an experiment. Weld is another yellow plant. So weld is gonna be like a taller plant you're gonna put towards the back of your bed or in the middle. Woad is going to be a shorter plant, maybe on the edges or more in the front if your bed is, depending on how the bed is configured.
Weld can get up to 6 feet tall, and it also spreads pretty dramatically because it spreads its own seeds. So if you can harvest it before it develops the seeds and spreads them everywhere, then you'll avoid having to pick weld plants out of your garden forever and ever. But it is one of the best classic dyes, and again, as I mentioned earlier, you can get a lot of different colors by using weld in combination with other dye materials or natural dye plants. It's one that I would say is like a must for a dye garden, as long as you can kind of contain the seed spreading.
The nice thing about dye plants is you will harvest them before they go to seed. So that's all the plants we're going to start this year in our specific Growing with the Griffins dye garden. So look for videos in this new year on how the seed starting process goes. And then also we're gonna harvest these plants and we're gonna dye something in the summer or fall. So look forward to that. Well, look forward to more videos in the future about this dye garden, and check out Textile Indie.
That's me.
It's Brittany. Check out Brittany's channel, Textile Indie, as well as subscribe to our channel, Growing with Griffins, and subscribe to her channel, and look forward to more content about this in the future. Brittany's gonna be vlogging about this a little bit, and also giving content from her dye garden and how she's done some different things that are more, she's got different plants in her dye garden that she'll talk about. Thanks for watching.
Bye.
Over the next few months, we'll be documenting our journey to plant a set of flowers that will make up our own dye garden. If you've been enticed to start your own dye garden, or at the very least a few of the plants we mentioned in this video, you will definitely want to include them in your garden plan for this year. And if you feel like you could use some help making a plan to achieve your dream garden, we have a video where we share our whole framework for garden planning. Go ahead and check that out, and we'll see you in the next video.